Okay, I'm back with Chapter 2 of Chris Hedges' The Death of the Liberal Class. And as I've promised, I will just try to hit a few of the what I think are the most important aspects of this chapter, which is entitled Permanent War. Now, Hedges starts out with a sort of critique of the corporations that he says profit from permanent war, and there's a sense that really we're dealing with what's going on right now. Even this was written in 2010, but one could say the same thing now, that we live in a state of permanent war because our consciousness is always tied up with conflict. There really hasn't been any cessation of it for 20 years at least. And for many young people, that's their entire lives. And he says that the corporations that profit from permanent war need us to be afraid. So he ties the state of permanent war directly to corporations that profit off of that war. So his notion, which he's going to develop actually even more in the next chapter when he discusses the beginning of this in World War I, is that profit is to be made from war and from conflict generally, and but people need to be behind these conflicts for them to continue. So bear with me here because that may sound a bit like conspiracy theorizing, but actually there is a lot of profit to be made from warfare, and the question is, are people being manipulated into supporting wars? So he says, fear stops us from objecting to government spending on a bloated military. Fear means that we will not ask unpleasant questions of those in power. Fear permits the government to operate in secret. Fear means we are willing to give up our rights and liberties for promises of security. The imposition of fear ensures that the corporations that wreck the country cannot be challenged. Fear keeps us penned in like livestock. Now, put aside the point about corporations for a second because he's not going to prove that for a bit. But just the point about fear. I remember shortly after 9/11 there was a debate, which was short-lived, about whether we should protect our civil liberties at the cost of vulnerability, or whether we should give up some of those civil liberties or diminish them for the sake of security. And over time, that debate kind of dwindled and went off into areas that are not listened to by the general public. And the conclusion seemed to be that security meant that some of our liberties needed to be somewhat curtailed. What Hedges is just saying here is that, in a state of conflict, people are afraid, and fear tends to mean that people put themselves into the hands of those who say, we can protect you, and we know how to do that. We need your cooperation. Then returning to his theme of the liberal class, he says that the liberal class can no longer influence a society in a state of permanent war and retreats into its sheltered enclaves. And so remember from last time, in the first chapter, he went through a fairly good list of these enclaves, but they include the so-called institutional church, which he says mutters pious non-statements. Eventually, the church supports whatever the conflict is, and he's talking about not just the Catholic, but also Protestant churches that tend to eventually find a way to get on the the bandwagon for a war in the name of national defense and patriotism. He then turns to a term that probably a lot of people will find uncomfortable, but he turns to the idea of the Christian fascist, the Christian who, he says, stands in the pulpits of megachurches and denounces Obama as the Antichrist. And he says, these zealots have little left to lose, we've made sure of that, and the violence they inflict is an expression of the economic and institutional violence they endure. Now, this is an interesting point because what he's saying is that in times of permanent conflict, the churches and other institutions of society produce this fear, and they point towards the solution, which is, you know, basically to support the government, and even if it means curtailing our liberties and freedoms, and that this is kind of like fascism. And of course, written in 2010, this talk would have made a little less sense or been a little bit more radical sounding than it probably is today, because back in the day when we talked about fascism, it was almost like using the term in a figurative sense. We didn't really mean that there were real fascists running around, but now there are. And so the interesting thing about this statement by Hedges is that he drops this notion that we ought to be somewhat empathetic here, in that he says the violence that they inflict through their anger and through their actions, if they act, is an expression of economic and institutional violence that they endure. That means that somewhere along the way, Hedges is going to explain that people who take this turn towards the supporting of violence wholeheartedly, and nationalism in the sense of, sort of pointing the finger at various groups as as a source of their problems, do so because they have real problems, economic and institutional violence directed at them. And this is something that we don't want to talk about right now in our debate between the, say, the left and their criticism of the far right as we now know it, and the far right and their criticism of the left. But Hedges is pointing to something real, which is that there are a lot of people in our country that have been left out and have fallen behind, and are the victims of something. And he calls it violence. And the question is, what is that? If it's not what they think it is, which might be immigrant groups, left-wing people in academia, etc. So Hedges says this is the yearning that we now see, and it's dangerous. Stern, who sees similarities between the deterioration of the U.S. political system and the fall of Weimar Germany, warned against a, quote, historic process in which resentment against a disenchanted secular world found deliverance in the ecstatic escape of unreason. Societies that do not reincorporate the unemployed and the poor into the economy, giving them jobs and relief from crippling debt, become subject to the hysterical mass quest for ecstatic deliverance in unreason. The nascent racism and violence leaping up around the edges of U.S. society could become a full-blown conflagration. Attempts by the liberal class to create a more civil society to respect difference will be rejected by a betrayed populace along with the liberal class itself. Well, and now we look at things and we see that this is rather prophetic, that this has indeed happened. And again, the interesting thing about Hedges' argument here is that, yes, he's definitely blaming, I'm sure he would, those who are what he would call fascists, but he's also blaming the so-called liberal class for basically creating the conditions in which this emerges. That there's a whole lot of people that have been basically left behind, and for which there is no help and no understanding, who have been shortchanged in a lot of ways by our society, and that this is part of the problem. That is what is unique about his contribution. Next, he introduces Sheldon Wolin's idea of inverted totalitarianism, and I think that's an important concept for people to understand, so I'll just read a bit here. He says the liberal class refused to resist the devolution of the U.S. democratic system into what Sheldon Wolin calls a system of inverted totalitarianism. Inverted totalitarianism represents the political coming of age of corporate power and the political demobilization of the citizenry. Inverted totalitarianism differs from classical forms of totalitarianism, which revolve around a demagogue or charismatic leader. It finds its expression in the anonymity of the corporate state. So while we might argue that we now have a sort of charismatic or demagogic leader in the White House, nevertheless, even so, that may be the case to a certain extent. Wolin's idea of inverted totalitarianism is not without merit too, and this ties into what Chris Hedges thinks is really to be blamed for the plight of an awful lot of people who have been what our current leader calls the forgotten men and women, and that would be the corporations. Corporate power means that the corporations in society have taken over the political power once held by the citizenry and have created the conditions in which people can be exploited into no jobs or low-wage jobs, because basically corporate thinking is we will do whatever it takes to be as efficient as possible and profitable as possible for our shareholders. And if that means that we will move our business overseas, if it means that we will hire immigrant labor, if it means that we will mechanize and computerize and make things so efficient that we need very, very few people, then that's what we'll do. And the result for a lot of working class Americans has been underemployment and unemployment, or what some people call the gig economy. And now they're being told, again, by people who are paid by government, by corporations, that is politicians, media people, people in Hollywood, that the problem is really something other than the economy, the changes in the economy, that it's immigrants, that it's extremists from the Middle East. I mean, these are problems, but the question is, are they the main problem? Are they the main problem? And Hedges is arguing, no, it's sort of like what do you call it, a shell game. Like, look over here while I'm doing this over here. He doesn't like our media much at all, because they play into the diversion tactics of what Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. People are diverted both by entertainment and also by their news, which becomes a form of entertainment. He says, Hollywood, the news industry, and television, all corporate controlled, have become instruments of inverted totalitarianism, as I illustrated in my first book, Empire of Illusion. They saturate the airwaves with manufactured controversy, whether it is the Tiger Woods sex scandal or the dispute between NBC late-night talk show hosts Jay Leno and Conan O'Brien, etc. Basically, he's saying that American workers have been betrayed by the new global economy, which is run by the corporations, and a lot of other people have too. And the media and the entertainment industry have largely not gone against that development, but have actually aided it. The next important person that he introduced in this chapter is Noam Chomsky. I'm just going to read a little bit of this because it's kind of prophetic. He says, he's quoting Chomsky here. The United States is extremely lucky that no honest, charismatic figure has arisen. Every charismatic figure is such an obvious crook that he destroys himself, like Joseph McCarthy or Richard Nixon or the evangelist preachers. If somebody comes along who is charismatic and honest, this country is in real trouble because of the frustration, disillusionment, the justified anger, and the absence of any coherent response. What are people supposed to think if someone says, I have got an answer, we have an enemy? There it was, the Jews. Here it will be the illegal immigrants and the blacks. We will be told that white males are persecuted minority. We will be told that we have to defend ourselves and the honor of the nation. Military force will be exalted. People will be beaten up. This could become an overwhelming force. And if it happens, it will be more dangerous than Germany. The United States is the world power. Germany was powerful but had more powerful antagonists. I don't think all this is very far away. If the polls are accurate, it is not the Republicans but the right-wing Republicans, the crazed Republicans, who will sweep November 2010 election. Well, he was a little off in a way, but, and, he's calling them crazed Republicans. His Chomsky's language may be a little extreme for your liking, but basically this is fairly accurate description of what happened in our latest election, and even Chomsky says the anger is justified, and I think that the answer is, why is it justified? It's justified because even though Chomsky is saying he's basically saying we will be told that white males are a persecuted minority. The reason why he mentions that is because, that story of white males are persecuted and they're a minority helps get them riled up so that they basically do what they're told and follow along with the party plan, the new party plan. So it's not that there's no complaint to be acknowledged, but rather that, I guess the cautionary message here is, always ask yourself, who's telling you that and why? Like, what's the agenda? We don't ask that question well enough. A little bit later on, Chomsky characterizes a guy that is basically sort of fallen victim to a lot of forces in society that have kept him from getting ahead. He says, I listen to talk radio. I don't want to hear Rush Limbaugh. I want to hear the people calling in. They're like Joe Stack. Quote, what is happening to me? I have done all the right things. I'm a God-fearing Christian. I work hard for my family. I have a gun. I believe in values of the country, and my life is collapsing. So, the theme just keeps going on here, that there is a problem, and that actually the liberal class is involved in giving an answer to that problem, which is not the right answer. That they're feeding into people's fears, that they're feeding into people's sense of paranoia, and that they're trying to keep people's eyes off the true problem, which is corporate power, which has kind of gutted the economy and made people's lives very precarious. So this seems to be the main message of this chapter. There's so much stuff in here that I couldn't get to but I think that's the core, is that, this is a kind of shell game, and people have been encouraged to look at many other things, including entertainment, but also, a sort of strange Christianity that celebrates conflict and violence, or at least puts the rubber stamp of approval on it, and news media that go on and on and on in 24-hour cycles about the latest sort of, I don't know, hot button issue or sensational happening, but really don't give people the ability to think through their own concrete situation, like, just why is it that they're underemployed? Why is it they have the drug and alcohol problems in their community? Why do they have crime? And this constant interference with people's ability to really kind of look objectively at the problem. So this is Hedges' purpose in this chapter, and then actually in chapter 3, which we'll be getting to next, he goes all the way back to World War I and shows you how this began to happen way back in the early part of the 20th century. And because in this second chapter it's been really kind of current, okay? But he's going to show you it didn't just happen recently. It's been happening a long time in his view. All right, so I hope you will hang in there for the next chapter, and see you then.